So, how do you structure your clinical case study to reinforce your clinical knowledge and reasoning? First, you select a patient who is presented with an acute coronary syndrome or other acute cardiac problem, such as a symptomatic arrhythmia. For this paper, once you've presented the clinical details, you provide a detailed 10-step analysis and interpretation of the ECG specific to the case. You use the pathophysiology section to delve into what is occurring at a tissue or cellular level. You connect this deeper dive to the clinical presentation and the ECG findings. Now, the next step is where writers can really excel. If you were to just list the treatments and link them to the CPG, you're only providing a description, not an evaluation. Top-tier writers will cross-reference the real-world management and/or advice from the CPG to peer-reviewed research and authoritative commentary to see whether the treatment offered or advised was optimal in the circumstances of the case you selected. This transforms the case and your description of it into an insightful evaluation of a contextually appropriate management plan. So let's reiterate what's required. Starting with the obvious, you need to select a case. The case must have an acute and primary cardiac focus. Presentations such as acute coronary syndromes, symptomatic arrhythmias, or cardiogenic shock that comes from a prime cardiac cause would all be appropriate choices. You will need the clinical information such as the histories that were gathered, the vital signs, the results of the physical examinations, and the relevant ECGs and details of any treatments. You can follow the template on the Moodle page to organise the case study, and essentially it'll follow these steps. The first step of the structure is just to introduce the case, that is to describe the presentation and what concerns you had regarding the patient's condition or their likely trajectory. You will present a 10-step analysis and interpretation of the ECG. The next step is to delve into the pathophysiology. To make this as pertinent as possible, you use the information to explain the patient's signs, the symptoms, and any abnormalities that have appeared on the ECG. The fifth step is to provide a critical analysis of the treatment provided, and by default, this will be involving the advice offered in the New Zealand CPG, especially if the treatment didn't cover all the elements that were specific to the guideline. The learning objective for this section demands that the analysis incorporates reflection on practice and research. So let's take a closer look at what that means. Reflection on practice is the critical analysis of professional decisions and actions. In paramedicine, many treatment decisions are guided by the clinical practice guidelines, where expert reasoning has already been distilled into structured assessment and treatment pathways. The purpose of this case study is to examine your actions and those guidelines within the context of a real case, validating or challenging the assessment methods and the recommendations that were provided. The initial sections of the case study establish the clinical context, while the latter sections focus on analysis and reflection. Importantly, this is not a personal reflection. Instead, it is a critical evaluation of the decisions made and the guidance followed. High-quality case studies do more than justify actions. They compare decisions against current evidence and expert opinion to identify what represents best practice and how future assessment and treatment may be improved. Let's wrap this up with a few words on the structural requirement for the case study. You will have submitted the formative version of the case study in the template. The summative submission utilises the same case, but you have the opportunity to use the feedback from the formative version to strengthen the summative version. Ensure that you've followed the instructions on Moodle regarding the structure for both of these versions. Confirm the word count in the course outline. The 2026 iteration allows 1,250 words plus or minus 10%, and this does exclude your references, headings and citations. For the case study to be successful, it must have at least 5 peer-reviewed references from an academic database. Now, this count excludes references to the CPGs, blogs, or articles and documents that are not peer-reviewed by an authoritative and/or an academic source. The case study needs to be formatted in APA style. Now note, this is going to include things such as using double spacing, as well as all those wonderful peculiarities associated with presenting citations and the reference list. Check the due date in the course outline and submit your Word document to the Dropbox prior to 9 a.m. of that day to avoid any penalties. And that's a wrap. If you have any questions or want any clarification on any of these points, don't hesitate to contact someone on the teaching team. In the meantime, ka kite.